Hello and welcome to Curiosity, a podcast discussing Christianity for the merely curious. I'm Trevor Cook, and I'm joined today by my co-founder and co-host, Andrew Bass. As always, we are here to discuss ideas and concepts related to Christianity in a way that's more meaningful and understanding. But today we're reaching the very end of one of our first series, the In Session series, where we have been going through the ecumenical councils. And today we are talking about the seventh council, Nicea II. So this one is going to be a fun one. I think out of all the councils we've covered, it's definitely the one with most practical application related to how you express your faith, how you worship, and what exactly you should keep inside your church. Because we have reached iconoclasm. Just for a little context here, Andrew Bass is a well-studied theologian. He has his master's degree in what's your master's degree
Theology,
again?
yeah.
Theology, yes. So theologian indeed, well studied. He would object to that, but it's true. And we actually met in St. Andrews, where we took a class basically entirely about icons
Yeah.
and
Images and
theology.
icons.
And
That-
that was our first class together. Since then, we took things like world oceans, but not as pertinent to the topic at hand. So it's kind of fun to get to end this series on something that we originally studied together back in college. So I'll let you go ahead and take it away from there, Andrew, and give some historical context about kind of icons in the early church and what is leading up to this great discussion that we're having today.
Yeah, so I won't waste too much time. For those of you that have been following this series, first, thank you for your dedication. But two, yeah, we're coming on the tail end of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And we know we use those terms, the seven councils of the undivided church. That's kind of where this comes from. There have been a lot more than seven ecumenical, well, there haven't, but there have been a lot more than seven councils held all throughout. Some attempted to be ecumenical, some intended to be local, but these seven were of what was largely the undivided church, where the vast majority of Christians, at least at one time or another, came together and said, yeah, the doctrines in these seven councils are what we agree on. This defines the faith. And we just left the sixth council where we were really just further clarifying Chalcedon, the two natures of Christ. That's the fourth council, is Chalcedon, where they established that doctrine. And then the fifth and sixth council talk about how that works, different energies of God, how that can be possible. And by the time we finished the sixth council in 680 AD, we have agreed not only does Christ have two natures, but he has two wills, and that's how that plays out. He has a human will and a divine will, and the more you try to explain it, the more inclined you are to become a heretic. And so we tried to stay within the lines of the council, and we have now reached the last one. What is fascinating about the seventh council, which is referred to as Nicea II, the second council of Nicaea, is it is an 8th century council. It occurs in 787. As always, there's a lot boiling up to it. But instead of just defining who Christ is, like the first six councils do, with the establishment of the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the deity of the Holy Spirit, the wills, the natures of Christ, this seventh council has much more to do with how we as a church worship in light of who Christ is. So we've got these six that define Christ, and seven will try and define Christ in some ways, but the more relevant thing is, how can we worship Christ? Namely, can we worship with images of Jesus Christ? This was the big question that came up at this time, and this is what led to the council. Trevor, I see you're wanting to say something, so...
Oh, I just love it because it continues the idea that not only are we talking about Christology, but like the ecumenical councils are the Jesus Christ fan club. Like they've met to discuss all about him, like what's his nature, what's his will. And now we're getting to the important stuff, is that should we all have pictures of him inside of our homes and our churches? And what does that mean? Is it respectful? Is it out of reverence? Is it a good way to worship? or is it somehow a violation or limiting that infinite like God quality that we've all established is within
Mm-hmm.
his nature and definitely a cohabiting part of his will? But this is like the difficulty, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we're now to the point where we're no longer even just discussing, you know, about like the theoretical side, but saying that if Christ was here on earth as a human, can we depict a human and call that Christ?
Yeah. Yes, of course, and there is precedent for that. So for those of you that may not know what we mean by image or by icon was the word that they used a lot. If you've seen those cool old timey kind of sepia tone looking pictures of different saints, usually they've got like pinched lips or they've got long fingers, and with Jesus, you'll see him holding the two fingers to represent his two natures, divine and
Mhm.
human. Those old school paintings, they're usually on wood. You'll see in Catholic Orthodox churches, some Anglican churches, Lutheran, um, everywhere really. You'll see them a lot more in those traditions. That's what we mean by images and icons. So this does have an impact on even down to like your nativity scene in your little Baptist church with your baby Jesus. This council will address all depictions of Christ, but they tend to be more aimed towards this use of icons, not necessarily Jesus in oh, now what's that TV show? I can't remember now. That's so popular now. Doesn't matter. The depiction of Jesus in TV or of your nativity scene, that's included, and people will discuss that. And some reform folks say no, even that's wrong. But this is more talking about the use of these painted images in worship. Can you pray with candles and icons of saints and Jesus around you? Can you have a depiction of the Last Supper on your altar in your church? These are the kinds of questions that people were asking leading up to this council in 787.
And now I think we need to discuss what's important about it because, first of all, like this wouldn't be a discussion if it was a practice in the church from the very beginning, but it wasn't. And it
Mm,
couldn't be for most part because it was under persecution that we were practicing Christianity. So this idea of being able to on public display like have symbols, images and depictions of Christ as well as the Mother Mary or other saints was not even a question previously.
yeah.
Additionally, if Christ lived during the time of video and photographs and stuff, and we had actual images of him, I'm sure the
Hmm.
discussion would also be different too. But everything uh, that is a depiction of Christ is an artist's interpretation, and it's something then that we are applying to the faith afterwards, after it moved out of being a persecuted, unfounded, unlanded like uh, religion to one that
Hmm.
is recognized by the state in Rome and stuff. I mean, this is a very important aspect of it. I mean, we've moved from the first or the zeroth ecumenical
Hmm.
council, which was the first one where they had to discuss, kind of the difficulty of this religion that
Jerusalem, yeah.
spreads across nations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
in Jerusalem, out of Jerusalem, and now we're to the point where it's, now that we have this established, like what is the right way to practice and to profess faith and show reverence, are we, muddling that with art now because we have reached the point where Christianity can include unnecessary extra, bonus things of beautiful depictions of art, which you
Yeah.
know you could travel the world now and see a lot of gorgeous basilicas and experience what is like Christian like theological art that
Yeah.
has existed now for over 1,000 years. And
Long,
this is
much
where it all
over.
begins, right? The big
Yeah.
discussion about should we remove it all, should we destroy it, or should we
Yeah.
keep it?
Well, totally. And you made an important point that we should spend a minute talking about. Was the one of the reasons this was such a big conversation and not just a one and done thing is because the practice of image worship or use of images in worship would be a better way to say it, was, as far as the historical record goes, from what I've read and from what historians I trust have said, alien to the early church, and for very good reason. We know the first generation church of the apostles and those who got to see Jesus in or right after his ministry and leading up through the second century, it makes sense for us that they would be very opposed to images. Remember, this was not a new religion created. This was the completion of the Jewish religion. This was the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham to bless all the nations, and it was realized through Christ. And these Jews, who were the first to receive the gospel, I guess the Gentiles received along with them, but the disciples working with Christ, it would be very hard to break them out of their context of no use of images, especially depicting God.
Right.
Which we as Christians believe. I think there's good reason to believe the disciples believed Jesus was God, and they were convinced of that. And so to think that coming out of this Jewish context that they would use images, absolutely not. And I'm convinced by the historical record that that is the case. That's one of the books we use a ton for reference in this series is Leo Donald Davis, who was a Jesuit Catholic scholar in the 20th century. And he says the same thing, that the early church was not fond of images. They didn't use them in their worship because of the second commandment, right? He notes that only about 200 AD, so 170 years after Christ, did Christian art really make its first appearance. And it wasn't until the 4th century that it really started becoming popular. So it's an early development, but we can see that it is a development. This is an idea that happened throughout the Roman Empire a couple centuries after Christ, and said, maybe we can make images. I want to read really quick a quote from Eusebius, the great church historian. He was requested by Constantine, his sister. She wanted an image of Christ. And he replied to her, Christians do not need any artificial image of Christ for Christ's historical image. The form in which he underwent the humiliation of the cross has been superseded by his divine splendor. His humanity has been amalgamated, there we go, by his divinity. This splendor cannot be depicted in lifeless colors. Rather, Christians must look forward to that moment when we meet him face to face in the glory of the age to come. So there, as you mentioned, it's not that this is unprecedented, it's a slow development, but the early church was very cautious about images. And so we can give some credit to those in the 7th and 8th century who also felt that caution.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely important to understand too that in the light of culture, what sets Christianity apart from, the Roman, the Greek gods and like their, mythologies is that they were all built on a lot of depictions, right? They did a lot of art, a lot of idols, a lot of worshiping at various special locations, and that was a very important part of it. In addition to that, what I've heard too is that at this time the growing religion of Islam is also very anti-depiction of God in any format. So you get mostly geometric designs within any of their what you could call art or architecture too, is that it's not trying to depict God or anything. It's just trying to be pleasant on the eyes. But there is this very distinct difference when it comes to depicting God versus just depicting other stories within the Bible too, which I think adds even more intrigue to this, because there are other images that are being discussed throughout this time period as well, which deal with the saints and everything. I don't want to get too much into that or get off topic from the council itself, but I think it's really interesting that in that context, not only does Christianity have a history of not depicting God, coming back from its earliest roots, but also just in a culture surrounded by kind of basically any monotheistic religion that they are interacting with is telling them not to depict God.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the context that brings us into the 8th century. So we're long past now the time of Justinian. II, and we enter the era of the Emperor Leo III. Again, influence all still in the East there. Not that the Roman Church didn't have influence, but the power of the empire, of course, still in the East. And Leo III was not a fan of images. He became emperor in 717, so we're still a good 75 years away from the council. He won't live to see it. It would not have happened if he were the emperor. He really took up the cause against images. And I'll say now, before we get lose track and get on from it, the East. Some of you may know the Eastern Church, Eastern Europe Church, Orthodox Church. Even today, revere images much more than the Western Church, including the Roman Catholic Church, does. And that development started early, and images were becoming very popular in the East and throughout the entire empire and all of Christendom. And Leo III in the early 8th century was pushing back against this. And he was really trying to strong arm and make the use of them illegal. He was what we call an iconoclast. He was against the use of images or icons in worship. Definitely a big no on depicting Christ. And he would turn to violent means to make sure that that would happen, that he could impose that teaching on the church.
Yeah, no, I saw a very good sermon about this, and I thought it was interesting because one thing I wasn't familiar with was the first Sunday of Lent is celebrated as they bring the icons back into the church, which is be something that was done after the Ecumenical Council here. And so I kind of imagine like beforehand that the iconoclast movement, in addition to the violent means used on people too, just the number of depictions that were likely destroyed and removed during that time, just it's a phenomenal amount of historical damage,
Yeah.
But it is kind of sad to see kind of how quickly that can change though too, from emperor to emperor.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So I think we're talking a lot about this now, this situation, right? We have the growing pains of Christianity now that Christian art exists, and then it's not for a couple hundred years that we have emperors taking up the opposition side, the iconoclast position, and greatly kind of pushing for there to be a removal of these icons from worship. Now, in this time period, I'm interested in finding out kind of like what the arguments are here, but also that there must be people on the other side of this issue, considering it's such a widely held practice at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the argument against images is kind of expressed in what Eusebius said and what we read from him. This was the idea, right? Scripture opposes it. Boom, that's the end. We don't see it early on. This is a development. Second commandment says
Graven images.
Yeah, and the church, a lot of people in the church were against images, but a lot also had a different answer. And so in the East, for example, the Patriarch of Constantinople, so the Archbishop, as we would say, Germanus, he was an iconophile. He loved the use of images. He believed he had a theological defense. And as we'll see, a lot of these people, especially Eastern, thought images not only were good, but were necessary for Christian worship. And so for Germanus in Constantinople, which had to be awkward for his next door neighbor, Leo, the emperor, he said that it is possible to make images of Christ, the only Son who is in the bosom of the Father. Why? Because he designed himself, he designed to become man. So we're not making an image of the invisible, the immortal God, or the Godhead, the Trinity, but we are making an image of the God who became man, the God who gave us an image to model after. And so for that reason, the incarnation now becomes the defense. the guy, the man that is Jesus. I don't want to just call him a guy. The God man Jesus, who we spent the last 650 years defending the doctrines of him in these councils, because he became man, because of all of this stuff, the two wills, the two natures, the image of God in and exemplified through him. Because of that, we can depict him. God essentially gave us permission in the incarnation to make an image of God, because Jesus is the image of God that we got to see visibly with our eyes, and we didn't drop dead when we saw it.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
No, I think that's interesting, because you are right that we've had all of this history now at this point arguing about protecting and maintaining the humanity of Christ, that he must be human for the incarnation to make sense, for it to work, for it to have resolved like all of our issues with sin. Like the humanity of Christ is necessary. And now when faced with the argument that, you know, what about God can we depict? Can we depict God as a man, considering he was one? Because we have in our entirety agreed that there was human nature coinciding in Christ. That like that I feel like is the argument, you know, the singular argument that you could make for it. Because I mean, even at this point, we have like other depictions too that we, you know, aren't saying need to be removed, but we're saying that they don't have place in worship. I think that is the main issue there, is because when, you know, we are revering Christ, we're doing so in worship, and if we are showing that reverence with icons, then there's the challenge. And I'm sure, you know, this is going to be something that develops even more so by the time we reach the Ecumenical Council. But
right. Yeah, and one of
I
the
think
other
it's a solid argument.
one of the other figures, and we'll address this now because then we'll get to Leo banning it in the leading up to the council. The biggest figure from history here in defending this view is John of Damascus, and so he was around until I think 749, and he wrote extensively on this. And so here's what he has to say about making images. If we made an image of the invisible God, we would certainly be in error, but we do nothing of that sort. For we are not in error if we make the image of the incarnate God, who appeared on earth in the flesh, and who, in his ineffable goodness, lived with human beings and assumed the nature, quantity, shape, and color of flesh. So this is the defense that they're making for the use of images. Again, going back to the incarnational view, John of Damascus just says it better than anyone else could. So he's the poster boy.
And you know, so here we face this issue now. And this is really interesting, because I feel like this is again showing the connection between the advancement of philosophy and thought alongside Christianity and its effect on how we view Christ. Like, philosophers have discussed nature, they've discussed will, they've discussed these key core issues that eventually create this question about, what about the nature of Christ? What about the will of Christ? And now that we have talked about images, or what likeness even means, how are we determining that idea of separation between that which is material and that which is conceptual, is now at the forefront of our discussion, because God the Father is never revealed, and there is no image, no likeness for us to know him by, except the likeness we know we are created in. And then we get Christ. So the bridge is connected. There is finally a way to cross what was an unbelievable gap in human understanding of God. That there was nothing for us to see, nothing for us to remind ourselves by, until this revelation, right? And in addition to that, I know like we get into the Holy Spirit, and we have the depiction of the dove to give us an idea of that. The tongues of fire, like all of these moments can be depicted and given as a means for us to have this reminder. I think that it was like back when I was in confirmation, as a Lutheran, just very young, just the idea that sinning is something that happens all the time. People are always like committing sins, but the challenge to us was that if we had the constant awareness, like if you were in the presence of Christ, right, even like the apostles, right, struggle with these things, but the idea that you could have a visual reminder of God, of his incarnation, his life, his death, his resurrection, and have that visual reminder be just a part of your worship, like gives you kind of another tool to access that awareness that otherwise is entirely you have to keep it up here.
Yeah.
Which is the other thing too that I think comes to mind with this, is that a lot of people struggle with the idea of idolatry. Like we are idolizing figures or like material things by making them in the likeness of Christ. But if you aren't, in your head you think of Christ and you imagine Christ as he was, as a human, like you are in thought considering God as just as physical and material a thing as the icon is that you are using. So I feel like that definitely establishes that there is this opening now to the ability to see Christ for people who have been born at a unlucky time, like Paul.
Yeah. Well, and it would go to become more than that. Beyond that, we have the privilege of literacy. So many
Right.
people in the early and Middle Ages did not know how to read. And so these depictions of the gospel, including depictions of Christ, they would go to become plastered, all throughout the walls. I mean, and we see that in the Vatican. If anyone's ever or been to the Sistine Chapel or seen, like, you would go to church and you would be able to see the gospel with your own eyes. Because whether the church wasn't letting you have a Bible of your own or whether you didn't know how to read it, this was the way that you were being handed the faith, and this is the way the gospel was being illustrated to you. These stories are being illustrated to you. That was not really the defense here. They went the theological route, but practically speaking, these images were very important. But
Yeah.
but I understand, even to this day, I understand why more reform-minded folks are like, no, Bible says no. I get it. I disagree, but I get it. And their point makes sense, and they can find church fathers to defend that view. So all fair. But yeah, the Emperor Leo III, not a fan. Didn't want
I think
it.
that's I think that's also the important part here, is to note that this is not saying that icons are necessary for worship, right?
Yeah,
The difference is, we're arguing, is it good, is it bad, and
yeah,
that
and
the Ecumenical Council finds that it is good. So
yeah, and the council will actually say that icons are necessary for worship, but thankfully our job at Myriosity is not to tell you whether or not you need to follow the instruction given there. We're just trying to bring you the story. So yeah, let's get back to Leo. He he did not like images. He really went on a path of trying to destroy him, an iconoclastic mission. So we've got Germanus in Constantinople. He gets deposed. he gets replaced. Leo gets rid of him, replaces him with a chaplain of his named Anastasius. I always want to say Athanasius, not Athanasius. Anastasius. So in 730, 731, he takes over. And this is the beginning of what will become another schism between the East and the West. Because the Pope Gregory, does not recognize this new guy, Anastasius, as the Patriarch of Constantinople.
I was
But
waiting for the first time we mentioned the Pope this episode.
yeah,
and
we
so
made it. We made it about half an hour
surprisingly
in.
took quite a while.
But so the Pope doesn't recognize him. This starts. It's the beginning stages of another schism. Anastasius obeys Leo's orders and basically orders for icons, images to be destroyed, and it starts happening all throughout the East.
Yeah. And I'm sure that was met with very, very happy tidings from the East. I'm sure. Like, thank you for coming in and telling us how to worship. We were waiting for the emperor to do that.
Yeah. And
so what?
Go ahead.
I mean, at this point, how many years out are we from the council still?
50.
Yeah, so it takes quite a while to make a permanent decision about this. Was there a fake council held in this case as well, or?
Yeah, there were a few, and there were some local synods. So Germanus is deposed in 730. Anastasius takes over. Pope Gregory dies in 731, and he's succeeded by Pope Gregory III. And this new pope convenes a synod. He holds a synod, a local council in Rome, and they excommunicate all of the iconoclasts. So any of those who wouldn't venerate or use sacred images were excommunicated and banned. And just like that, the East and the West, the Roman Church and the Eastern Church, were once again in schism with each other by 731, 732 AD.
Dang. Okay. So wait, did they schism because the West was iconoclast, or?
No. So I don't know. I may have mixed up my words there.
It's the other way around, right?
Yeah. The Pope,
the East is iconoclast, and then the Pope was pro-icons, and that's why, yeah.
All who refused the use of images, icons, basically all of the East, thanks to Anastasius and Leo's campaign, they were excommunicated. And so essentially, yeah, the East and the Western Church were in schism. The West defending icons, iconophils, and the East denouncing them, iconoclasts.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that, as mentioned before, that Islam and kind of more Eastern like culture and stuff at that point had an impact on the church regarding icons? Or do you think that it was purely based on kind of the same arguments that we see today in Protestantism deriving from like the Old Testament?
I don't think it would have been much influence on Islam, because all of the Christian church was set on mission to correct what they called the Mohammedans. So they, at this point, they were considered a Christian heresy, cult basically that had formed. So they wouldn't have been taking much influence from them. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think so. But we'll get into more defenses here, and we'll kind of get to see it. So Leo dies in 740. His son, Constantine V, takes over. This guy hates images even more than his dad did. And he makes this argument, and here, I'll read it here. If an image of Christ pictures only his human nature, it severs that nature from the divine and is a false image of Christ. So, can't just make an image of the Son, because you're not representing Jesus, you're a heretic. If you attempt to picture both the human and divine natures, it's an attempt to reduce the divine to limits, to circumscribe the divine, something which is impossible. So now you're trying to compose God in parts and contain him. So his conclusion, and again I'm pulling this from Leo Davis, is that Christ cannot be pictured. The only real image of Christ is the one which he himself gives us, the true image not made by hands, the Holy Eucharist.
That is really a drop the mic moment. Like, all you get is bread and wine, actually. I really find that strange, though, is because, like, not to turn this into just some, like, Reddit argument, like, because this is really, like, Constantine is opening up, like, a thread here that could very easily just be like, oh yeah, well then if I try to pick the divine, is that going to work out well? You know, like, it's not. It doesn't make complete sense. It's like because art isn't good enough for Christ, you can't even attempt to use art.
Yeah.
I would make a lot more sense if he had an issue with the worship side of things, but if
Mm-hmm.
it's literally just your depiction isn't accurate to the divine side, to the invisible side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can't draw invisible, and therefore you don't get any
Yeah.
images. I don't know. I think it seems pretty hollow, but if he's
Yeah.
living out his father's legacy, you got to give him a little bit of
Yeah.
leeway, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah. But so that was his argument, that it's impossible to depict Christ. You can't do it accurately, and if you do it, you're committing heresy for the reasons he mentioned. So this goes on for some time. There's still a campaign against icons. And in 754, they try to have a council, a church council, to once and for all get rid of icons. There is an empty seat in Constantinople. No one from Rome shows up. But they hold the council. They anathematize all the iconophils. They anathematize John of Damascus, and they claim, as we've seen 5 times prior, that this was the 7th council, and it was perfectly in line with the previous 6. So that was the Eastern pseudo council of what did I say? Yeah, 754 AD.
Right.
And it got so bad, it got to a point in the East where monks weren't even allowed to wear vestments. They had to wear like daily, everyday clothes.
Wait,
So
they included the clothes with that as well? Like,
yeah, so the priestly vestments, which they would have images on them, but yeah, monks. It really was kind
a
of
habit, right? Is that
yeah.
what it's called?
Well, yeah, and I don't know if they weren't allowed to wear the habit, the robe, but yeah, the full vesting, which usually included images. At least it did by the time of the Middle
Oh
Ages.
yeah.
So that was out, and they were in everyday clothes. It was kind of like what we saw from the
For
rat.
listeners who haven't heard of that before, like vestments are still something worn today by, like, I think it is true for Lutherans.
Mm,
Anglicans as well for the most
yeah,
part. Or there's some
yeah.
like, yeah,
And you're
but
right.
they
I'm looking at the notes here, Trevor. You're
it's
right.
nice.
The habit was banned, so monks were wearing layperson clothes. Couldn't pray to saints, so all that veneration was done. It was outlawed. It was banned.
Yeah.
And in
I know
770,
that they were wearing
oh
like period clothes, but in my head, I just
yeah,
envisioned all these monks and like Levi's and like,
yeah,
polo shirts,
yeah.
just going around the monastery. Yep.
But that, so all that happens, and in 775, so now we're very close to the council. Constantine V dies. His son Leo IV becomes emperor, and he had married a woman named Irene. And this is where things get juicy, because Irene was an iconophil.
Crazy.
Yeah.
She's playing the long con here. I think there's a
Yeah. And so she marries Constantine's son,
Mhm.
and did I say Leo IV? Yeah. He dies, and in 780, 7 years before the Second Council of Nicea, Leo IV dies, and Irene, the iconophil, the lover of icons and of monks and all the vestments,
Mhm.
takes over power in the empire.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, the idea of like that someone could marry into being the empress of Rome is pretty impressive. And then
Mm-hmm.
on top of that have like the opposing like theological view for that century, you know.
Yeah.
Really it seems like so unlikely and
Mm-hmm.
so cool that it actually happened, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Must be.
so it was her desire to have a council. She reached out to a monk, I think, by the name of Paul. That's not relevant, but she wanted to have a council. She reaches out to the West, to Rome, and now Pope Hadrian is the Pope.
Mhm.
and she reaches out to him, asking him if he wants to have a council, maybe try and reunite after this is their second or third schism now. And he agrees. He comes back with a letter, and this is such a papal letter. He condemns iconoclasm, and he outlines the role of the Pope. He's like, by the way, guys,
Oh yeah.
I'm the successor of Peter. I don't know if you know this, but you have been in schism with the true church. Essentially, he
Yeah.
lays out this papal argument that will ultimately lead to the Great Schism. But again, we've seen this argument for the papacy building all the way from Philip. Was it in the Third Council?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They're
400
always
years
like,
ago.
so about the council, and then
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
the chair of Peter is mine. Thank you.
Yeah. So he says this. He says, I'm the Pope. I'm the defender of orthodoxy. Iconoclasm is wrong. One, because I say so, but two, because it's just the true teaching. Um, and they try to have a council in 786. There's a little bit of a war going on. And so in 787, we finally convene the Seventh Council, the Second Council of Nicea.
Amazing. Well, it took a while to get there,
Yeah.
and I imagine is it gonna take a while to actually resolve all of this now that everyone's in the same room together?
No. No, the council finishes in that year to my knowledge. I don't know how long it was,
Wow,
but it
pretty
went
quick
pretty
one.
yeah. Yeah. It went pretty smoothly. There was good representation there. Somewhere around 300 bishops. Um and they did defend icons and the use of them, and we can read that document here in a minute. But they also defended and approved Pope Hadrian's letter, outlining himself
Mm,
as the successor of Peter and defender of orthodoxy. Now, the
yep,
successor of Peter part, not a problem. The whole church would have recognized, duh, you're the Bishop of Rome. Peter was the Bishop of Rome. But the
yeah,
defender of orthodoxy, these papal claims, were affirmed in the Seventh Council, which we see to this day is a huge Catholic W. Because they point back to the council and say, see, the early church was
see,
Catholic. And in this instance, they've got merit. They've got something to stand on because
they were.
this letter was affirmed, including the papal declarations.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like there was I think there was a. I'm trying to remember if it. I believe it was Seinfeld. There was an episode where George got a job just by saying that it was his job, and just like over and over again telling people that until
Yeah.
eventually, like they were like, "Oh yeah, well that's his role." Um, this seems like the situation here.
Yeah.
Um, I I can't imagine, like, after all of this time, all this conflict over icons, to have the like papacy affirmed just on top of that.
Hmm.
Um, was there much discussion about it beforehand? Was it really that out of the blue, or like was there any like kind of roilings around, Rome's authority prior to this?
Well, yes and no. The council was short. Like we said, it was not long. Um, but
Hmm.
there were the hundreds of years of the East rejecting these papal claims. And so
Right.
I don't know. I would have to either transport and be there or read some more stuff that I just haven't read. But it came quickly. I think they were probably also much more concerned with addressing icons. But I don't want to mull over that fact that they did endorse Hadrian's letter, and they did it intentionally. It wasn't an accident.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it didn't outline the papacy as it was outlined in the Middle Ages, or definitely not in the First Vatican Council in the 19th century. But this is we do see here this affirmation. Um,
Hmm.
so regarding images, here I'll read maybe some of it. It's somewhat long, but I'll just read their affirmation. The bishops affirmed this with all certitude and accuracy that just as the figure of the precious and life-giving cross, so also the venerable and holy images, as well as in painting and mosaic, as of other fit materials, should be set forth in the holy churches of God, and on the sacred vessels, and on the vestments, and on hangings, and in pictures, both in houses and on the wayside, to wit, the figure of our Lord and Savior, the God, Jesus Christ. of our spotless Lady, the Mother of God, of the honorable angels, of all the saints, and of all the pious people. For by so much more frequently as they were seen in artistic representation, by so much more readily are men lifted up in the memory of their prototypes, into a longing after them, and to these should be given due salutation and honorable reverence, not indeed that true worship of faith which pertains only to the divine nature, but to these, as to the figure of the precious and life-giving cross, and to the books of the Gospels and other holy objects, incense and lights may be offered, according to ancient pious custom. For the honor which is paid to the image passes on that which the image represents, and he who reveres the image reveres in it the subject represented.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's it. There you have it, folks. All summed up.
If you
Like,
caught
I
there,
think that, oh yeah, please.
if you caught there, they define Mary as our spotless Lady, and so
That's yep. I hear it. No, after all the arguments before about Theotokos and stuff, now that they're united in Rome,
yeah,
it seems that there's a very consistent take on Mary.
yeah, and it took some time for this council to be affirmed, just like the rest of them. During this schism, the Pope or the Roman Church had made an alliance with Franklin, and so they had to kind of deal with this unity they had made with the Franks for about 7 years. And it really wasn't until 843, so like another 50 or 60 years, that the Patriarch of Constantinople declared all sacred images lawful, and basically condemned iconoclasm. And so from that point on, 843 to 1054, the East and West enjoyed their last reunion together before they split once and for all.
Oh, how sad that is, but that's the difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've seen it coming from 1,000 years away, but
Yeah.
So now, I guess, what's the impact for today? I mean, I know we're coming up on time here, so kind of how would you wrap this up, Andrew, on like what's the impact for worship now? Because I mean, obviously icons are a huge thing in Christianity, but clearly that there's not a consensus on it, even amongst post-Catholic Protestants, who have all at one point agreed with this council.
Yeah. I mean, I think to spell out what the implications it has are difficult, because here, I'll put it this way. At the time of the Reformation, this is something we've talked about before, a lot of the reformers and a lot of the Catholic Church would reference the four general councils, which is the first four. This idea of the 7 ecumenical councils actually came out of Eastern Orthodoxy. It is, in one sense, it's a historical reality. I mean, it's the councils of the undivided church. But this kind of view of these numbering the ecumenical councils, even in the Catholic tradition, is kind of a medieval development. Now, I want to be careful to say that because clearly, as we've read, that they would say like, oh, the last 6 councils were in agreement with. So there was an understanding of what it meant to be an ecumenical council. But this numbering of the 7 is an Eastern Orthodox development. And I think implications just for the modern church, for those that use images, it gives them a defense. It provides a historic and rooted theological argument for depictions of Christ that give a legitimate answer, whether you agree with it or not, to those who come at you with the second commandment and say no images. And you can say, okay, well, let's see, at least John of Damascus interacted with this. The witness of the church testified to this. So I think that's what I'd say. If you're opposed to images, I at least hope that you're charitable with your friends who aren't.
Yeah, even if you don't believe that they're necessary to recognize that even the written name alone is something that we do that's unique to Christians, that we believe we can even speak what is, God's name in worship in such a way. And I think it's a really lovely episode altogether, Andrew. So thanks for doing the research and coming on, and it's been great going through the ecumenical councils with you.
Always
and it's crazy
fun
to think that we've reached the end.
Yeah.
Gosh. All right. What will we do next? If you want to find out, keep listening.
Yeah.
And for our YouTube viewers, thank you for watching.
Thanks.
This is Miriosity. You can find us on Spotify, on YouTube, on most social media platforms, and we'll try to post more TikToks. Please like, subscribe, and go visit an icon near you. We appreciate your listening.
Thank you. Bye.